I have often been asked, what actual practical freedom and benefit does free software bring to the non-programmer type person, a user of a computer, if they don't do any programming and such things themselves? What freedom and what actual practical freedom does free software bring to them? I've been asked this often when I have told the people who are not programmers and are not necessarily not interested in computers, who would really benefit from the source code, who wouldn't really benefit from the source code being available, when I've recommended to them free software and told them that proprietary software is bad. And of course, there are the philosophical and such reasons to use free software, even if you don't use any of the source code, and even if you don't do anything with those source codes and all that, there are still, of course, the philosophical reasons. You still should have the freedom even if you don't necessarily practice it all that much. So it's still important to have that. But there are still practical advantages, and that is what this speech will be about. There are some practical examples, and I will give you at least one. This speech might not be that long, but I'm still gonna do it anyway. So I will now start with a good example. The choice of desktop environments. And specifically GNOME and its derivatives. You see, when you are switching to the GNU plus Linux operating system, one of the biggest choices at the beginning when you are choosing a distro, one of the more important choices is the desktop environment. What kind of a desktop environment do you want? Well, different people want different types of desktop environments. So it's good that there are choices, good that there are options, so that people can get the desktop environment they want. Now, when you look at a lot of the desktop environments, many of them, well, let's look at specifically the GNOME-based GNOME derivatives. You see, look at this fact. The desktop environments, GNOME, Cinnamon, Mate, those are all basically variants of GNOME, derivatives I mean. In the past there was GNOME 2, and lots of people liked GNOME 2, but then GNOME 2 became old, and because a new version of GNOME came out, GNOME 3, and then lots of people didn't like the GNOME 3. So a bunch of people decided, well, let's keep GNOME 2 alive and just rename it under the name Mate, and now it's Mate. So basically, when GNOME 3 came out, there are now two different choices. You get the new GNOME 3, or you can continue using the old GNOME 2 under the name Mate. Mate basically is GNOME 2, just under a different name. So, if GNOME 2 were proprietary, you would only get GNOME 3. You couldn't use Mate, because Mate wouldn't exist, there would just be GNOME 3 now. So, that's one more choice. And then, of course, there were also the people who looked at the GNOME 3 and said, well, I don't really like that, but GNOME 2 is also like this old version, and GNOME 3 is like this newer version. So let's make a new version of GNOME 3, a different version, a different kind of desktop. And that's how Cinnamon came into be. It was made by the Linux Mint people. So they basically took GNOME 3, the new version of GNOME, and then they forked that and made Cinnamon out of it. And now here you have 3 different desktop environments, 3 different choices. You would only get one choice, you would only get GNOME 3 if it wasn't for the fact that GNOME is free software. So now you have more choices, more options, more desktop environments to choose from. So if GNOME was proprietary, you would only have the option of GNOME 3, And that's it. And also, there are other desktop environments that use the GNOME, it was called the GIMP toolkit first, but the GTK toolkit anyway, whatever anyone wants to call it, whether it's the GNOME toolkit or the GIMP toolkit, who cares? There are also other desktop environments that use it, for example XFCE. If it were proprietary, there is a chance that something like XFCE could still exist, but now XFCE would also depend on proprietary software if GTK was proprietary software. So even if XFCE existed, it would be proprietary software. So the fact that all of this is free software, now you get a lot of choices, and they are all free software. So that's one practical advantage that you get with free software indirectly. When you the user, don't do any programming yourself, even if you don't need any of the source code, other people will use the source code to make more things, and you get to use those other things that people make. So, more desktop environment choices. That's one practical advantage. There are forks. Lots of forks. Many choices. So that's one example of a practical advantage. There are many desktop environment options. But of course, there are usually other advantages to free software. Practical advantages. Oftentimes the free software doesn't really restrict you in weird ways like proprietary software tends to do. Usually you can do whatever you want, like the free software programs are quite powerful. They allow the user to do whatever they want. There are no weird restrictions in place. Not usually anyway. Of course it's possible, but not usually anyway. It usually respects the user's freedom in more than just a philosophical way of giving them the source code and the rights to use it. But also there are practical benefits. The software actually allows the user to do whatever they want with the software. So there is a practical advantage to that too. Comparing the desktop environments to something like Windows, with Windows you just get the desktop environment Windows has. So the desktop environments are a good example of the practical advantage of free software. You can install the desktop environment of your choosing, and there are multiple options. There are lots of forks. And GTK and GNOME derivatives is just one example. There is also the Qt toolkit and all the derivatives of that. So those are also a thing. So GNOME and GTK aren't alone, but just as an example. So yeah, that's that for this speech.